If it's all right with you, I thought I'd spend 10 minutes and just 10 to 15 minutes and just talk about some of the key messages that came out of the last, what we call the AR6, the Assessment Round 6 cycle of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So it produced 6 reports in the last 8 years. The one that I first served on was the 1.5 report, which was a special report talking about what difference it makes if we're able to hold the world's temperatures around 1.5. That was a very fraught report to serve on. There was a lot of criticism about why we would even bother, because we knew we were going to crash through it. What it really taught me was that actually bringing the conversation into the present, because we are now very close to 1.5, if not through it really for reasons I'll talk about in a minute, means that we're talking about issues that we can see right now. And I was thinking about how much that conversation has changed, because in 2018, when that report came out, I had to do a little piece for Radio New Zealand, and they said, what are the key messages? And I said, well, one of the key messages is that we can see climate change now. What we are observing is the effect of human-induced climate change. And the reporter rang back and said, do you want to correct that first sentence? You made a mistake that we can see climate change now. And I said, no, that's the report. And I realised that suddenly we've brought it into the present tense, because we were always talking about the bigger things that would happen later. And suddenly it's something that we are understanding has already affected, and for many of us it's already affected our own memories of climate. If you think, as Sam Dean from NZILA points out, if you think about your own historical experiences of climate, growing up here in Otatahi Christchurch, I remember Mum hanging out the nappies, and that was when we had cloth nappies, and my little sister's nappies would like freeze in the morning under heavy frost, and it was really exciting to go out there and punch them and break them into tiny little fragments. Now, we don't have frosts like that anymore, and it's a kind of an unusual but shared memory of a cohort of what it used to be like. But certainly when the adaptation report came out in 2022, there was a lot of debate behind the scenes. The evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat. Since 2015, what's changed? Well, the world has agreed that climate change is real, that we can see it. Trump's administration pulled out not because they disagreed with that, but because they didn't want to pay for it. And there was a debate about how much the US should pay for this. The big debate was the further delay in global action will, now this was the whole debate about the metaphor, will miss the rapid closing window that we have to act. And the problem is that you don't want to appear like the child that cries wolf, because we have about a decade. What I hadn't understood as a political scientist till I served on the panel was the fact that to establish a global mean, you use a multiple years of average temperatures. So it's not the first time you crash through 1.5 or the first time you crash through 1.2 or 1.3. It's about the decade in which you've done that you would say that, okay, we can now agree that the world has warmed. And I think also, as a political scientist, it took me a long time to really understand, well, you think, well, 1.5, it's not much, it's not much since the 1880s. And as my physics colleagues quickly taught me, that is the mass that we're heating the atmosphere and our oceans. It is an enormous shift in global temperatures. And if we were thinking about and had worked more with communication experts at the beginning, we would have talked more about climate change or whether we talk about emergency or crisis, I'll come back to later, but we would have used language that was easier for people to understand, because initially people were saying, well, this temperature is warming, but we're not seeing it. We're seeing massive rainstorms or snowfall or heavier snowfall or whatever. So trying to explain that severe shift took a while. And then I remember a communication expert telling the panel, why did we choose greenhouse gases? 3/4 of the world has never seen a greenhouse. It means nothing to people. Why didn't you just say heat trapping gases? And it's those kind of things that are so practical, but at the edge of making people understand the world around them in different ways. And it's a real joy to talk to landscape architects who are working at the interface of what communities are experiencing and what they might imagine could be, and how we might achieve that shared imaginary. So the basics are, yes, we have observed at least a 1.1 to 1.2 degree warming since the 1880s when we started using a lot of fossil fuels. Yes, global warming has caused widespread disruptive change in climate. And things like the Black Summer for Australia, which had effects over here as well, those are sort of dramatic, and they are, as we know, identity-altering experiences for communities as well. The complicating factors are the compounding and cascading nature of the risks. Already about 3.3 to 3.6 billion people are living in what we would call climate hotspots, which are places where they are highly exposed to severe climate change. But those hotspots, while most of them are in sub-Saharan Africa, in the small island states, and in parts of Asia, particularly where we've got humidity issues, also within cities, we can have communities that are more excessively exposed to heat than others, or more excessively exposed to different climate effects. And it's cities that I worked on co-leading the report for and learnt a lot about concrete, and actually it's a joy to talk at an event. You never think you get to do these kind of things, where actually concrete and transport are two of the key things when you think about cities being the site of over 70% of the world's emissions. Cities are at the scale at which people can actually tackle that. So the fact that cities and sometimes states in the US context are so important is why the US was able to continue its downward decline in emissions even when Trump had pulled out from the Paris Climate Agreement. And I would just also emphasise that there's 24 countries in the world, and New Zealand is not one of them, which has managed to have a decline in our emissions for over a decade. And I think we forget to say that. And they're big economies like the US and like the UK. Yes, of course, there's a lot of European countries in there, and there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. So yes, of course, there were lots of countries that are able to quickly switch. It's from high emission to other kinds of energy, and our profile is challenged in that way with a lot of hydro and a lot of methane. But we are at risk of talking ourselves out of the ability to imagine how actually easy it is to do this. And it does really matter that we think about the city scale of emissions because, from my point of view, working also on issues for youth, by the middle of this century, by 2050, 66% of the world will be living in cities. New Zealand is already one of the most highly urbanised in the world. But 7 out of 10 young people under the age of 24 will be in cities. So cities are where major population, innovation and change is happening, and major exposure to risk. One of the things that was different about this set of reports that we produced was an emphasis on health. So climate-related illnesses, including the threats on mental health and well-being, are observed now as increasing and interconnected, but unevenly distributed. And we know now much more about the effect of green space on mental health and well-being and its climate abilities. So there are lots of things that you're sitting at the interface of in terms of the co-benefits for communities that make an enormous difference. And we also know that most countries in the world have now produced climate adaptation plans, but they haven't actually implemented them yet. And we're not adapting fast enough. The other thing that we really know is that there are increasingly large, what we're calling adaptation gaps, between the action that is being taken and the action that's needed and where it's needed. And the gaps are the largest for the poorest communities. So one of the key messages that came out of the final synthesis report is if you have limited funding, which nearly everyone does for reasons we'll talk about in a minute, spend it on the most marginalised and the poorest communities, because that has the biggest effect. Now that's not going to be what happens, because the communities who are the most well-heeled, the most resourced, are going to be the ones that are demanding the seawalls. and for all sorts of reasons that hard protection is a problem. But all the research shows spend the money on the poorest and it has the biggest flow-on effect for the wider community. And it's not all bad. I'm taking the beautiful Riccarton bush here because there are options we can take to reduce risks for people and nature. But there are some processes that the research that's been reviewed for this last 8 years has shown overwhelmingly make a difference to effective adaptation. So AR6 stands for Assessment Round 6, has highlighted that adaptation solutions that are effective are ones that are both feasible and conform to principles of justice, both procedural justice, and I really emphasise this as we're about to go into fast-tracking legislation, which, from my listening, leaders from the left and the right are welcoming as an opportunity to get their projects through. And there is nothing in the evidence that shows that fast-tracking is the way to go. In fact, fast-tracking is a path to maladaptation because it doesn't conform to the basic evidence, which is that you need procedural justice. So you need to ensure that you do give time and opportunity for people to have voice and to debate issues. You need to make sure that you've dealt fairly with the distributive justice, who's benefiting and who's going to bear the burdens of this, and how are we going to adjust for that? And the recognition justice there, whose voices are we hearing and what and why and where? So it might contribute to the obstruction economy that the Prime Minister talks about, but inclusive, integrative and equitable decision making is the most effective. There is now 4 decades of research that shows this. One of the things that it was a privilege to be part of was the effect of Trump pulling out of the Paris Agreement was that there was a fluster about where the land report would be held, and we got a call about whether New Zealand would hold the special report on land, and so we ended up holding it here. And I would really like to pay tribute to Nai Tuhariri and Professor Tamari Tau, who, when I rang him and said, so can we bring 160 scientists out to you? Fine. And the timing of that was wonderful because while the IPCC is an inherently conservative body because it's going on the common denominator knowledge, it was what was important about these reports, and particularly in the synthesis and the final reports on adaptation from last year and the year before, was that they recognised the value of diverse forms of knowledge and specifically talked about the value of Western scientific and Indigenous and local knowledge to understand and evaluate climate adaptation and the processes and actions we need to reduce risks. And not only that, but for the first time they had Indigenous and local contributors to writing reports about issues and community experiences and knowledge. The concept that we are hoping to talk about a lot is climate resilient development, which is integrated adaptation and mitigation, and trying to get communities and countries to understand that the most effective actions are the ones where you are both reducing your emissions but also protecting your population. It's not always possible, but it often is, and it's more possible than we think. It reduces climate risks through the adaptation, it reduces greenhouse gases through the mitigation, it enhances biodiversity, and the big argument is it supports sustainable development for all. But there were some key things that were highlighted that made this very significant, and one of them was that 197 countries signed this off, and they signed off that the process of making climate resilient development possible is inclusive procedural justice. So we signed that, but all the nations signed it, so that's why it takes so long, because they all have to agree. And it has some direct effects for on-the-ground practice, which I'll come back to in a minute. But I just want to talk briefly about cities for a second. The importance of physical and green infrastructure was really stressed in this round of reports. So most countries are investing in physical and grey infrastructure, the things like the seawalls in particular, but also early warning systems like sirens. Now, there are, of course, early warning systems are crucial, but as everybody here will know, the problem with the physical infrastructure, especially the seawalls. If you think about anywhere like St Clair, for instance, they're just creating both a moral hazard, as everybody feels, oh well, we've got the seawall and we'll keep investing, and we have a huge problem that's just happened within Westport. If you think about the 14 homes that Kāinga Ora is now building within basically that temporary, what is to be a temporary walled area. It's unbelievable that that's been enabled. So the IPCC is trying to emphasise the importance of integrated green infrastructure, the nature-based plus engineering approaches, the green and blue spaces, and using them creatively. The roles of urban agriculture are moving from the fringe to central ways of thinking about how to support particularly large cities and informal cities, where we're seeing largest movement is into the informal slums and communities, but also into medium-sized cities. So thinking about how those areas are going to be serviced is important. We don't think enough about the integration of the green and the social infrastructure. We have, after COVID, suddenly started to understand the importance of social safety nets, like income replacement, like health, education investment in a crisis, the role of social cohesion, of trust, of whanaungatanga, of the basic opportunities, that by designing spaces that support those opportunities, you are creating those opportunities for that coming together of people that have all the wider benefits we know, the public health improvement, the ecosystem conservation. One of the key messages from this series of reports has been around ecosystem-based adaptation, about building resilience of biodiversity, supporting ecosystem integrity and its benefits for livelihoods, people and well-being, and protecting and restoring those ecosystems being essential for biosphere resilience. The importance of thinking carefully about land use, including trees and where they're planted and how they're planted and what they're planted, because if we don't think about those, we are really risking exacerbating a lot of the fire hazards, the social cohesion and the problems that we know only too well after the Gisborne disaster. Biodiversity and ecosystem services have limited capacity though to adapt to warming levels. So there is also a kind of a worry that we have as authors, that there are two things that are happening. One is that governments have signed up to climate resilient development because that sounds like, you know, resilience, we can do it. Actually, we can only do it if we are making decisions in just, fair ways. And they're all signing up to nature-based solutions, except that the Global South doesn't like the term nature-based solutions because it also sounds like something we can do, you know, like just fix these things and we can fix our excessive, unfair and unjust emissions with nature-based solutions. But we also don't know how those nature-based solutions are going to work once we crash through 1.5 and get closer to 2 degrees of warming. So some of the key things that the government signed off, which I had to grin as a political scientist, is yes, they agreed that political commitment and follow through and well-aligned policies are crucial. And if you don't think that, just think we have just had 3 inching years turning the curve down. And now we have an incoherent climate policy, I have to say. And we're unsure what the next alignment will be. It's perfectly feasible that we could have a strong emphasis, and we need a bigger emphasis on technological development. But that has to be aligned with thinking about reductions in infrastructure and reductions in practice. It's not a get out of jail free card to just put more solar panels everywhere. So enhancing knowledge, getting our institutional frameworks right, our clear goals and priorities, and an inclusive approach to governance were all seen as key issues. But in particular, I would stress planning to identify low regrets options that enable mitigation and adaptation in the face of complex, deep uncertainty and divergent views. Landscapers are the first to understand the times that we have fast-tracked what we thought we needed. High-rise buildings in Grenville Towers, for example, create pathways that lock in dependency and create disasters of their own. So it is crucial that we actually think professionally about how we're going to develop these climate resilient pathways. Our past choices and actions have already limited some. And many communities with low income, low resources have fewer opportunities to diversify. The key barriers that, again, 197 countries acknowledged were a lack of political commitment, a lack of private sector and citizen engagement, this is globally, insufficient mobilisation of finance, this was a huge issue, particularly for developing countries, low climate literacy, but really that's because of a low climate. It's not just that people don't know, but that we actually need to then use what we know to put it into practice. And just a general low sense of urgency. But I would be careful what we wish for. I've always resisted the term climate emergency, and I still resist it. Experiencing the Christchurch earthquakes as a Democrat, I'd always resisted the use of emergency powers. We've never seen emergency powers used effectively and sustainably in ways that produce good outcomes. Yes, it is frustrating where we have multiple jurisdictions that have multiple regulations. There are things that we could change and we need to change. But if we get into this mentality that everything is an emergency, then we're stripping our children and our future of not only a sustainable future, but a democratic one. And my real worry is that there is an unspoken consensus now, and we've seen it with ECAN, that actually these fast-track powers are going to be quite good because they're going to enable the things that we all want to get done, whoever we all are on different sides, which introduces a kind of clientelism that we have not seen in New Zealand government for decades. We had low rates of corruption, but we now have our MPs saying openly to their local electorates, well, what do you want on the list? And the moment that you can do that as an MP and skip your parliamentary practices and the normal scrutiny of everyday business, we're in trouble. And I know that it will bring a lot of business for professional organisations like landscape, like building, like construction, like law firms. And I know that there's massive alignment to fit in with this. But as professionals, as people who care about democratic practice and people who care about avoiding maladaptation and low regrets, these are issues we really need to think about carefully, while recognising that we have had difficulty in the past and still have difficulty getting big, expensive projects off the ground. Because adaptation finance comes predominantly still from the public sector. As a leading banker said to me, Bronwyn, we just haven't figured out a way to make money out of adaptation yet. So it comes mainly from public sources, as noted in the reports and the summaries, and there is a big cost disparity, so it's already starting to cost more. The best adaptation you can do is to do it at the beginning, but mostly, especially in developed economies, we're retrofitting everything, which is expensive. But overwhelmingly, the investment that we do have, which is not enough, is spent in mitigation. So finally, in closing, I just want to emphasise this problem that is a big problem for nature-based solutions, which is that climate resilient development is already challenging, and it's going to be more challenging as we get into warmer levels of global warming. Ngāi Tahu's whakatauki mō tātou e mō ka uri a muri ake nei, for us and our children after us, has never meant so much as it does now. But I would say that is also wonderful to be able to mention, we are very proud that we're hosting the United Nations World Adaptation Futures Conference here in Aotearoa, and we really are hoping that we will be able to work and feature, in particular there is a big feature around cities and climate adaptation and use and biodiversity. There's a big focus on Indigenous and Pacific leadership, and there's a big focus on infrastructure and agriculture. So we are looking forward to continuing this conversation, and we are really hoping to work with ways in which we could feature some of the key things that you're doing and the key industries to another 5,000 researchers and practitioners and companies, both not all travelling. We're going to make it, which has made it an incredibly expensive undertaking, to be also broadcast through UN TV, but also here. So kia ora, and thank you very much for having me. It's fantastic.